G'day and welcome to the Sea Creatures podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists and people that have an intense passion for marine life. My name is Matt Testoni and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Sea Creatures podcast is Dr. Charlie Veron. He's a marine biologist and an author and the former head of the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and crazy fact, has discovered nearly 25% of the world's corals. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Hello.
Today we're going to talk all about coral, which I think is fascinating because the first thing that pops to mind is they're not a plant, they're actually an animal. So can you tell us a little bit about what coral is?
Well, coral, as you say, is an animal, a very simple animal like an anemone, but it actually lives like a plant because it's got algae in its tissues. And so the algae photosynthesize. And so coral is entirely dependent on sunlight for growth. And because it is powered by sunlight, it can occupy a niche in the oceans that nothing else can live in effectively. So corals build their own homes and they're very tough and they're very durable. And they've been doing that for hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about where exactly they live, given that they're like kind of using the sunlight for energy. And because they also, some can eat as well, can't they? Not just eat sunlight. Oh yeah,
they can live, all reef corals can live on nothing other than sunlight, seawater, and what they get out of the seawaters. But they most have tentacles and they've got stinging cells and they capture food, a lot of food. But surprisingly, they depend on the algae more than what they capture. Corals are very many different sorts of corals and they have a very wide spectrum of life forms like trees, so that what's true of one coral is not true of another and so on.
Yeah. And so I guess when people think of corals, they often think of those big, really colorful, hard reef corals that form these huge colonies.
Yeah, the word coral means a variety of different things, but basically hard corals, as we call them, they either build reefs through photosynthesis, or about half of all species live in very deep water, and they're really taxonomically very different and ecologically completely different. But reef corals are in shallow water. They must have sunlight. They need a temperature. They're very fussy about temperature. If the temperature is too low, algae can outcompete them and they get smothered. If the temperature is too high, the algae produce too much oxygen and that becomes poisonous. But they have to live as much as possible on the brink in order to outcompete all the things that they live with, as well as outcompete other corals. So corals really have a very, very fine-tuned existence, which at the moment is the cause of their demise.
And so just before we kind of talk a little bit about coral bleaching, which I'm really keen to hear about, I just want to first know, how do corals make such mega structures?
Well, they extract calcium carbonate from the seawater, and they're very good at doing that. And they literally turn that into limestone, into aragonite. And that is they build these hard, strong skeletons. Some are very massive and very solid. Some are very fast growing, like staghorn corals, and their skeletons are brittle. But they all build skeletons out of calcium carbonate, out of limestone. And then later on when they die, that limestone then is cemented by coralline algae into solid reef rock. And that's over thousands and hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Reefs can be, they can be enormously thick, 5 kilometers thick in places.
Wow. And I guess that's how you end up with structures like the Great Barrier Reef, which are amazing places.
The Great Barrier Reef is quite thin, actually, compared with others, because the Australian continental shelf is very stable. So they can only live between the sea surface at low tide and the substrate. And that normally is not much more than 100 meters, which is very, very little. A bit more in here and a bit less there. So the Great Barrier Reef is fairly thin. And of course, corals everywhere in the world, because they live in shallow water, they're very prone to being wiped out by sea level change. And we've had many monstrous sea level changes in geological time. They've been slow enough that the corals can regrow in different places. So that's how atolls are formed. If a mountain is slowly subsiding, the corals form a ring around the mountain. But as the mountain slowly subsides, if it doesn't go down too quickly, the corals keep on building this ring until it forms an atoll. That was Darwin's brilliant deduction. It's quite correct.
Yeah. And so speaking of Darwin, actually, that's a good little segue because your first name isn't actually Charlie, it's John.
Yeah.
But people call you Charlie after Charles Darwin. So
I've been called Charlie since I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
After Darwin.
So, how did you develop such a love for coral and for the ocean?
Ever since I was a little toddler. I used to go down to, I lived in Sydney, and my parents used to take me down to the beach and out to rock platforms, mostly in the northern beaches of Sydney as a littlie. And I used to rip off the rock platform like little kids do then, but now hopefully. And I had my little aquarium back home. And so I fell in love with marine life. And then when I was at university doing postgraduate work, I took up scuba diving. Scuba diving was very unusual then. Only sort of wild young men went scuba diving. It's a bit like skydiving today. But that brought me to contact with coral reefs, and coral reefs completely won me over. So I did an abrupt career change and became a marine biologist, in fact, without ever attending a lecture on marine biology. I've given a few.
Oh, wow. And so you became, I think, was it the first scientist to work full-time on the reef? Was that correct?
Yes. At that time, the Great Barrier Reef's future was very shaky. The Queensland Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, was wanting to turn it into a massive oil rigs and mine the reefs for limestone, for sugarcane. That was defeated by the Whitlam government. But the whole notion of reefs was not really in the domain of science because scientists didn't go diving. In fact, I got a postdoc to work at James Cook University because I was the only person that applied for it. You had to be a diver after you had a PhD. Well, I was getting a PhD and I was a diver. And so I got the postdoc for no better reason than I was a diver. Yeah. First full-time job as a researcher on the Great Barrier Reef. Yeah.
Wow, you must have seen some pretty amazing things in your time. What is the best thing you've seen on the reef?
Oh, gosh, so many. I've worked in all the major coral reef regions of the world. I guess I certainly had a lot of exciting times, but in those days, I had a lot of free rein to do whatever I liked, wherever I liked. So I had a time which students now can only dream of. But I think probably the most exciting places I've ever been to in the northern Great Barrier Reef, in fact, the outer Great Barrier Reef, because it's a very wild place. There's lots going on. There's big animals, there's little animals, there's diversity, and it's so much alive in its primordial state. I've written a book about it all. The book's only just starts to dip into the sorts of things I came across and that we discovered in this time. It was a time of enormous amount of discovery, and I love that. Probably the biggest land discovery of all was Rain Island, because that was virtually an unknown thing when I led the first expedition to the far northern Great Barrier Reef. And Rain Island is one of the most incredible places on the planet. And nothing was known about it until we turned up.
Wow. Wow, because I've actually been lucky enough to go scuba diving just on the outside zone of Rain Island and on the Great Detached Reef. And having done a bit of diving on the normal reef, I was, as you said, I was blown away by all manner of life. You've got scorpionfish, tiny little scorpionfish on the reef, and you've got tuna going past. Yeah.
The Great Detached Reef is a wonderful place. There's no doubt about that. The outer face of it really is amazing. It plunges down to abyssal depths. But when we had that first expedition there, it was not known how near the Great Barrier Reef got to the Queensland Trough. In fact, the outer wall of the Great Barrier Reef is the wall of the Queensland Trough, but we didn't know that. We were diving down that outer face expecting to be more or less like the inner face. But of course, it's completely different. And then I think around Rain Island, Great Detached Reef, if you go in the right season, the turtle breeding is incredible. We found it was over 20,000 turtles in one night. And that was far and away the biggest green turtle rookery in the world. And it was astonishing to see that. And also when we getting in the water, the tiger sharks had come in, feeding on the turtles. And to see those magnificent animals underwater was really very exciting. But there's so much to see in that whole region that every day brings new and wonderful things. It's a fabulous place.
And unfortunately, as you're saying, climate change is a pretty tough issue for the whole reef, and in particular corals. And I'm interested to hear, like, what exactly is coral bleaching? Because we hear a lot about there's coral bleaching on the reef, this huge part is, but I feel like a lot of people, and myself included, don't fully understand what coral bleaching is.
Well, corals have this algae in their tissues. The algae is microscopic, very, very small, single-celled algae. Just a few of these cells for each coral cell. And as we've just said, that brings nutrients to the corals. But the corals get the biggest bang for their buck. So they get the algae produced as much as they possibly can by selecting the right strain of algae and so on. There are many different types of algae, or strains of this particular algae. So they get the strain that really maximizes the amount of food. Now, when they produce food, it's through photosynthesis, and that also produces oxygen, which is all very well until you get too much oxygen. And almost all animals, us included, die if you get too much oxygen. So the corals realize that they've got algae in their tissues, realize inverted commas, they've got pathogens in their tissues and they expel them. Algae are what give the corals their color. And so when they become expel their algae, the corals go white. Then the next thing is the algae are this essential source of food and a lot of other things. We don't know quite why corals are so addicted to their algae, but they are. And so this is what, if they've expelled all their algae, they can't get food and they just literally starve to death. So when that happens on a very, very big scale, involving big areas, we call it mass bleaching. And bleaching because they turn white, and mass because it covers a big area. I've known coral bleaching since the 1990s, but it was around about the turn of the century when we saw the first really grand scale mass bleaching, when whole areas of reefs turned white and died. And once the corals died, it ceases to, it gradually decays and it gets covered with algae, and other organisms just can't live in the coral anymore. So it all becomes very quiet and like a graveyard. And a great deal of the reefs of the Great Barrier Reef are just like a graveyard. They were vibrant and full of life, and a vibrant, full of life reef is quite noisy because it's full of all sorts of little critters that chatter to each other for one reason or another. But when they go bleach, and they just turn into rubble, and that's it. Yeah. They may grow back, they may recover.
Yeah, and so I know yourself, you're doing a lot of work to kind of safeguard the future of coral. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, for many years ago, I had a lot of contact with the aquarium industry, especially in America. And I was fascinated by their ability to keep corals alive. Not only keep them alive, but the corals, when they're given a suitable environment in an aquarium, they grow like nothing on earth, really grow well. So a staghorn coral may go 20 centimeters in a single year, or a plate coral can expand. So corals do very well in aquaria. And so I thought, well, it's pretty prudent to keep endangered species in an aquarium, just in case they go extinct in the wild. And I sort of brewed on that until I discovered or came across a mob that calls themselves Legacy. The group that started Legacy, they really had a mission to save as much as they can of the Great Barrier Reef and to bring that to the public, bring awareness to the public. It's a very noble NGO. And I fell in love with that NGO, and so we partnered up. And so that's why I do a lot of the work for Legacy now. The big thing at the moment is that we are starting a coral biobank with the aim of keeping all the species of the world in aquaria. It sounds fairly far-fetched and bizarre, but it was only last week we collected the first 30 species, and they are now housed in aquaria, and well, they'll live and they'll grow, and they cut up, and the pieces can be sent to other aquaria. And so every 6 months or so, they can be harvested and sent further on. So from a single source like an aquarium, we can export corals to aquaria everywhere. So when, and as they are, species are going extinct in the wild, at least we have them in aquaria. And also we have a genetic bank, so that further down the track, when DNA research makes really good discoveries, and we're pretty confident they will, we'll have the brood stock, the original stock from the wild that they can work on. And so when we collect corals, we're preserving them for DNA work and any work that will bring good science to conservation. So if you go to the reef now, there's plenty of beautiful places to go to. But most places now have nothing like the diversity they did have when I was a youngster. So when I first worked on the Great Barrier Reef, I spent 8 years trooping up and down the Great Barrier Reef intensely, diving all the time. And so I saw an awful lot of it. And really that reef just doesn't exist today. No one will ever see it like I have. And I find that's extremely sad thing to say.
Yeah.
But on we go. We're going to do the best we can to keep those corals going.
Yeah, and I think that, as you said before, it's like what Legacy do is such an important job, and yourself, to hopefully one day we can start, rebuilding what we've lost, hopefully.
Yeah. In the meantime, we need to do as many things as possible to help corals along. If you like, it's aiding evolution. And we should bear in mind that with the corals continually being hammered by bleaching, there's very intense natural selection going on. So we are hopefully seeing survival of the fittest, and certainly some species survive much better than others, but it's all happening too quickly for the normal processes of evolution to take place.
Yeah.
The corals have been decimated in the past through climate change, but that's over thousands of years. We're doing it in a single human lifetime. So that's the issue. The only real solution is to stop producing the carbon dioxide that's causing it all.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, what if, anyone listening, if they want to help out coral or do stuff to help prolong coral, like what they should do? And so obviously the first thing is tackle climate change, but are there any other specific things that they can do?
Legacy engages a lot with volunteers and people keen on preserving the reef. They've got a website, and go to that. But everybody should be aware that political pressure really works. Without political pressure, we don't change things. So especially young people are talking to their parents, and older kids and parents and other people. They're putting pressure on politicians. Australia's track record is pretty bad, and we are really lagging behind now. So the more pressure we can put on politicians, the more we are likely to see changes that will really make a difference. So that's what everyone can do, and everyone should do, if they care about the planet and they care about forests and the reef and so on.
Yeah, well, there we go. So I guess if you want to help out coral and the Great Barrier Reef, then climate change is the number one thing.
It is, yeah. And with so many other ecosystems as well. But really, coral reefs have been hurt much more than most. Up until the fires that we've seen a year ago, really coral reefs stood out by far as the most damaged ecosystem. And it's only through fire that a lot of the terrestrial ecosystems are catching up. But both are being really damaged by climate change. Scientists have been warning of that for, to my knowledge, over 40 years. I know I've been speaking about this to anyone who will listen to the media and conferences since the turn of the century. So things happen slowly, but they are happening now. Climate change, only 10 years ago, climate change was something most Australians didn't even believe in. Now, most Australians definitely do believe it's real, as well they should.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for I was really happy to see a little while ago, the New South Wales government put in a really good climate change plan. And I'm hoping one day we see a federal plan come into place. We
have to. At the moment, Australia literally is lagging behind all the developed world. We're doing badly. A lot of the Australian way of doing things is to make excuses or fudge things. This has been going on for a very long time. So we'll have a plan, be it carbon capture or carbon trading or whatever it is. But all this is nested in small talk, but making sure it doesn't work. So Australia is still mining coal as fast as it can, and coal is the primary driver of climate change in the world. And so we are making money now to the very detriment of our planet. And certainly young people should be looking aghast at what Australia is doing. And they would have every right to say, you're making money out of my future, because we are. It's very simple. And getting around all this is surprisingly simple. What's happening now with renewables is very straightforward. It's been around for a long time. Australia is mostly behind most other countries, but not all. And we are getting into energy sources, renewable energy sources, very, very quickly. This is not driven primarily by politicians. It's driven by people and the behavior of people, and getting solar panels on their roofs and not wasting electricity and so on. So people are getting on board all this rather ahead of government action. I'm hoping this will change and the two will go more hand in hand. They have been. But it wasn't only a few years ago that the government was almost denying, in fact, Tony Abbott was denying climate change. I found that quite extraordinary. This happens in other countries. Trump has never believed in climate change.
Yeah, it's incredibly intense. And I guess, seeing the Great Barrier Reef and seeing the coral bleached and knowing that coral species are going extinct and that one of the world's natural wonders will probably disappear because of coal it's just mind-blowing.
It is.
Well, just before we wrap it up, to kind of finish on a bit of a high note, I want to know what your favorite coral species is and where you can find it.
Ooh, I haven't got any favorites. I guess my favorite is an Acropora tenuis. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a very ordinary Acropora, but it's battle hardened. It will bleach, but it's very reluctant to bleach. And so when I go to a badly damaged reef, there is Acropora tenuis keeping on, and good on it. And I hope other corals can learn the lesson or pick up on the as yet unknown way that Acropora tenuis seems to be escaping what other corals can't escape. I guess that's my favorite coral now.
I love how you describe it, battle hardened. And so that's found all over the Barrier Reef, is that right?
It's very widespread in the whole Indo-Pacific, across the Indo-Pacific,
Awesome.
From Japan all the way across the Indian Ocean, Pacific.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining us on our coral episode.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Sea Creatures podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Matt Testoni. You can see more of my photography on Instagram at Matt_Testoni_photography and my webpage, mtunderwatermedia.com. If you like today's episode featuring Charlie Veron, you can read more about his amazing story in his book, which is called A Life Underwater by Charlie John Veron. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and visit our Patreon account, patreon.com/seacreaturespodcast, where you can help with a little monthly donation to help the running of the show. Production assistance by Georgia McGrath and music by Dan Musil and his ragingly cool slide guitar. Tune in next time to hear Dr. Sue Mason talk all about dolphins. This has been the Sea Creatures podcast. Over and out.